So for the unit circle, I want you to draw a nice big circle on your paper. Make it nice and big, all right? You can use at least half the size of your paper, okay? Okay. So you get one nice big unit circle. So there are some key points on this unit circle that you want to know. Okay. So the 2 points on the x-axis, the 2 points on the y-axis that intersect the circle, and we know those points already, so we can go ahead and put those on. We know that the one on the x-axis is at 1, 0, and 90 degrees we got the 0, 1, and then negative 1, 0, and at 270 we get 0, negative 1, right? So those 4 points we're responsible for, but then there are 3 points in each quadrant that we're responsible for too. So if you split that quadrant in half, there's a point right in the middle, and then there's one below it and one above it. Okay, and you can do that in each quadrant. They're not evenly, they're not evenly spaced through the quadrant, but something like this. Okay. Okay. So how many points is that? Total. We got 3 in each quadrant, so that's 12 points plus the 4 points on the x and y axis. So 16 points that you're responsible for knowing, and those are the only 16 points on that circle that you need to know. There are another infinite number of points on there. Don't have to worry about this, okay? But these are the 16 points you got to be able to calculate and find, and there's 3 things you want to do with each point. Okay, so you want to let's start with the first point. These 3 points in the first quadrant come from our 3 reference angles. So this first coordinate comes from 30 degrees, right? And if we draw our 30, 60, 90, so this is 30 degrees, I'll put 30 degrees here. If we draw a 30, 60, 90 right triangle outside the circle with a hypotenuse of 1, we know that the side opposite is 1/2, and the side adjacent to 30 is √3/2. And we can use that to find the coordinate of that point. If I start at 0, 0, how far right do I need to go and how far up do I need to go to get to that point if this is the triangle that I'm working with? What would the x coordinate be? Well, if you need, I'll draw it in here, but I'm going to erase it in a second. So this would be √3/2, right? So I need to go to the right √3/2. That's my x value. And then the height would be the 1/2, right? Because it's that triangle. Now, if I go into the second quadrant and do the same kind of thing, using the same reference angle, I'm going to go only 30 degrees from the x-axis. Well, we know that we're at 180 degrees, right? Half a circle is 180 degrees. And so if we go backwards, if we subtract 130, what angle are we talking about? Yeah, 150 degrees. Because we just subtracted 30 from 180, or 30 from 180, right? And it's the same exact triangle with the same reference angle, and so we're working with the same exact side lengths. And so what's that coordinate going to be? negative root 3 over 2, comma, 1/2. So it matches, almost matches the same point in the first quadrant. The absolute value of those numbers are the same, but what's different is because we're in quadrant 2, the x value is negative, right? And then we can go to quadrant 3 with the same kind of triangle, and it gets to that same point. So if my reference angle's 30 degrees, well, I'm at 180, half circle, and I go 30 more, so where am I at? 210. And what would that coordinate be? Negative root 3 over 2 and negative 1/2. So same values, it's the same order, but now both of them are negative because we're in quadrant 3. And then one more time. Okay. And how do we find this one? Well, if we think about the angle on the x-axis, this is 0 degrees, but it's also 360 degrees, right? And we need to go back from 360, 30 degrees. And so that's going to be 330 degrees. Sorry. And we want that coordinate. Which is going to be what? Positive or negative root 3 over 2? Positive root 3 over 2. And then positive or negative 1/2? Perfect. Okay. So we need to be able to find the coordinates of these points. We need to know what angle they go with, and we need to know what radian they go with. Now, let me show you. The same way we got the degrees is the same way we're going to get the radians, and I'll work through that with you here. Okay. We know that pi is 180. What do you have to divide 180 by to get 30? 6, right? So 180 divided by 6 is 30. So pi over 6 is 30. And so this is pi over 6. It's the same thing as 30 degrees. Okay. Now let's go half circle. 180 degrees is the same thing as pi, but I'm working with over 6. So this is the same thing as 6 pi over 6 at the 180 mark, right? And I want to go back 30 degrees, but remember 30 degrees is pi over 6. So if I'm at 6 pi over 6 and I go back pi over 6, where am I at? 5 pi over 6. So 150 is 5 pi over 6. See that? Now if I'm at 6 pi over 6 and I go forward pi over 6, where am I at? So 210 is 7 pi over 6. What might I have to do to get to 330? And think how we got 330. We had to have 360 minus 30, right? Okay, so this is 12 pi over 6 here. And we're going to have to go back 1 pi over 6. So what is that? 11 pi over 6. Good. And now what we've done is we've done all that we need for those 4 points. Okay. And now we need to move on to the next point, which is created by a 45 degree mark. Right? I'll use green for the 45s, and there's one in each quadrant. Oops. But let's go after the angles first. Okay, so we know the green is 45 degrees in the first quadrant. How can we find it in the second quadrant? what do we do mathematically? If half a circle is 180, or if we go from 180, what do we got to do? Subtract 45 from 180, and what do we get? 135. Okay. And then if I want to go to the third quadrant, I add 45 to 180, which is 225. Good. And if I want it in the fourth quadrant, I got to subtract 45 from 360. 315 degrees. Okay. So let's try that with radians. Okay. So we got to think, for first quadrant, we got to think, well, 180 divided by what is 45? 4. So what would 45 be in radians? Pi over 4. Okay. And at 180, since we're working with 4, 180 is 4 pi over 4. And 360 is 8 pi over 4. Okay. And we can use that to help us find what one. So what's 135 then? If we go back from 4 pi over 4, we're going back 1 pi over 4. 3 pi over 4. And if at 225 would be 4 pi over 4 plus a pi over 4, which is 5 pi over 4. And how about 315? We go backwards from 8 pi over 4, 1 pi over 4, and get 7 pi over 4. So here's, the same way we got degrees, we can get radians for those locations. Okay? And then if you can get the coordinate in the first quadrant, you can reflect it to your other quadrant. So you just need to focus on that first quadrant. So what do we know about that 45, 45, 90? Well, if the hypotenuse is 1, what are the side lengths? Both of them are root 2 over 2. And so what's that coordinate? Root 2 over 2, comma, root 2 over 2. And so we're just going to reflect that around the circle at those locations. But we need to respect the quadrants, whether the positive, what's positive, what's negative, right? So in quadrant 2, we have x negative and y positive. Quadrant 3, they're both negative. And quadrant 4, the x is positive and the y is negative. Okay. So we have a few more points on here that we need to find. The angle, in degrees and in radians, and the coordinate. Go ahead and try to finish that. So what angle would go with the red? I put red here in the first quadrant. What are we talking about? 60 degrees, good. And what would that be in radians? Pi over 3, because 180 divided by 360, so pi over 3. And if we're working with that 60-degree angle, opposite would be root 3 over 2, with the hypotenuse is 1, and the adjacent would be 1/2. So what's our coordinate? What's the x value of the coordinate? 1/2, comma, root 3 over 2. And notice the coordinate for 30 degrees and the coordinate for 60 degrees are just flipped, right? Same values, because it's the same triangle, just in it oriented differently. Okay. So now let's reflect that to the second quadrant, and we get negative 1/2, comma positive root 3 over 2. And if we go back 60 from 180, what's 180 minus 60? We get 120 degrees. And then if we're thinking about pi over 3, well, 180 would be 3 pi over 3. And so we need to go back pi over 3, and so 120 would be 2 pi over 3. Okay, done with quadrant 2. Quadrant 3, reflect that point again, and you get negative 1/2, negative root 3 over 2. Both are negative. What angle in degrees? What's 180 plus 60? 240. And then in terms of radians, add pi over 3 to 3 pi over 3, and you get 4 pi over 3. One more quadrant. Reflect that point one more time. Get positive 1/2, negative root 3 over 2. And we go back 60 degrees from 360, we're at 300. And how about the radians here? What are we going to get? 5 pi over 3. All right. All right, have we got everything we need now? We're missing a couple things. Anybody see what we're missing? For each point, you need a degree and a radian. There's a couple points up here that we don't have degrees and radians for. Okay, so at 0, 1, so at 90 degrees. We know that's 90 degrees, right? So let's put 90 degrees there. And then what would that be in radians? 180 divided by 2 is 90. So pi over 2. Okay. We know 180 is pi. We got that. We know 0 degrees is 0 radians, and 360 is 2 pi. Okay. One more spot. At the point 0, negative 1. So first let's do angles. What angle is there? How do you know that's 270? 90 plus what? 180, sure. So if you start from 180 and add 90, you get 270. You good with that? So if we're working with radians, that's 2 pi over 2. So if we start at 2 pi over 2 here and add another pi over 2, where are we at? So there we go. And now we've completed that unit circle.